In our previous episode, Claire Wickes very graciously stepped in for me while I was away on tour to give you the fundamentals of the woodwind section. Now we take things a bit further and talk about how to implement the woodwinds into our music. Let's start off by talking about solo writing, as this is how we typically hear the woodwinds in the orchestra. Normally, having 8 woodwind players in the orchestra, we end up having pairs of the same instruments. Whether one of them doubles on an auxiliary, or whether 4 more players join to make a section of 12, we still only have 1 or 2 of each instrument. Therefore, it's not much of a surprise that we hear woodwinds in a solo context quite often. So, what is good writing in general? Now this is obviously subjective, but maybe a general start for good writing for any instrument is when a composer is able to pick the most effective character of the instrument or make idiomatic parts without making things unnecessarily hard for the player. An idiomatic part refers to a line or passage in music that is well suited for a specific instrument, both because of the ease of playing, the timbral quality of the music, and the common playing techniques and limitations of that specific instrument. So when an instrument is able to shine and show off what it's best at, and a good player is able to comfortably and repeatedly deliver that music, then we'd probably all agree that that's good writing. This doesn't mean that you can't write more complicated or more virtuosic passages, but you should just keep in mind that if you write music that's a pain in the ass to play, then you'll have a harder time finding players and orchestras who want to play it. So let's kick off with the flute. The flute often gets a lot of solo action, as it has a lovely, clear, brilliant sound. In the second act of Ravel's opera Daphne C'est Chloé, we get a really wonderful flute solo that shows off the full range and registers, but also the full dynamic range of the flute too. It starts with some wonderful runs, lovely long phrases, and we also hear the sparse arrangement around the flute solo, with some very soft string pads, harp, and the occasional pizzicato notes. Generally, the flute gets louder as it goes up the range, but in this example, at Mark 178, we get a high D played triple pianissimo, followed by a phrase that crescendos up to a forte of the same note. It really shows off the dynamic capability of the flute, and the runs that follow it at Mark 179 are a great example of the agility the flute has. The one thing I'd add though is that while the dynamics are impressive, the actual volume of the solo flute in context to the whole orchestra still isn't exactly loud, and you can see that Ravel is always giving the flute space in the arrangement and keeping the parts under the solo fairly light. When we arrange for solo flute, its top 2 octaves are always going to be clear and have lots of dynamic control, but we obviously can't have everything else playing forte underneath it. It wouldn't be much of a solo then. The bottom of the range of the flute is the only area where you might want to arrange the rest of the orchestral parts around it more delicately, especially if you do want that softer character from the flute. Onto the oboe. The oboe is even more soloistic, as it has a very distinct timbre due to its extra strong overtones. Even pairing 2 oboes has to be done carefully, otherwise they don't blend well together. Oboe solos are usually very clear and dynamic, with light arrangements around them, and even more commonly, we see the oboe is switched to a cor anglais for solos, which has an even more beautiful and rich tone. We're cheating a little by showing the oboe's bigger brother here, the cor anglais, but there are good reasons. Not only do we get this wonderful lyrical solo showing the tenderness of the English horn, but we also see how 2 clarinets are used to very softly accompany the melody over a bed of pianissimo strings. The whole texture is beautifully soft and affectionate. The English horn is a transposing instrument, and all horns sound a perfect fifth lower than written. So here, we're mostly in the middle register and move into the high register as the solo goes on, between a MIDI D3 and a MIDI F4, so the part spans an octave and a third. The members of the oboe family are sort of opposite to the flute, as they get quieter as they go up the range. Dvorak isn't using the low register the cor anglais offers, which is louder and bolder. Instead, he's in the sweet spot where there's the most dynamic control and a sweeter, softer tone. Next, clarinet. The word that springs to mind when I think of clarinet solos is lyrical. They can speak from nothing and creep in and have really smooth dynamics, so long phrases feel sort of frozen in time somehow. They get lots of solo passages or little soli areas in orchestral music where they can sit on top of a texture and take the melody. Soft divisi strings underneath solo clarinet, eventually also joined by 2 bassoons and 2 horns. You're probably getting the idea with the accompaniment for solo passages by now, but it shows off how soft and round the tone of the clarinet can be, even up in its clarino register and approaching the high register. It's wonderful long phrasing. Rachmaninoff has the clarinet oscillate between softer and slightly louder dynamics, and you can hear the slight change in the clarinet from around mezzo forte and above, where a bit of that reediness and brittleness is introduced to the sound. The solo also stays within an octave and a third, from a sounding MIDI G-sharp 3 to the sounding B4. So it's not really going into the high register, but also not going down to the throat tones or crossing the break in the clarinet. This means the timbre of the whole solo remains consistent. As the passage isn't technically challenging for the player, they can really concentrate on the tone that they want to produce and the way they want to express the music. And lastly, let's round up with the solo bassoon then. This excerpt from the Firebird is all a bit of a masterclass in orchestral writing anyway. The way the bassoon eventually hands over to the oboe, but also again with the very sparse muted strings and harp harmonics, a really great combination with the tenor register bassoon playing. It's kind of remarkable that the solo is all within a fifth, but importantly, again, it doesn't move into the high register. It all stays within the comfortable, most dynamically controllable part of the instrument, albeit in the upper end, and this tenor register of the bassoon really pokes out even when played quietly, and it always sounds very clear. When it comes to arranging for the woodwind section along with the rest of the orchestra, we really need to go back to the thing that we always mention in our videos: musical intention. We need to think about which sound we want in our arrangement and then figure out how to implement that in our music. So, let's look at how to do this with the woodwind section as a whole. Let's think of the range of the entire wind section, from top to bottom. With the winds, all the instruments have a similar set of registers. So, if our musical intention, alongside the rest of our orchestral parts, was something like loud and shrill, then we'd know that we should pick the high registers in each instrument. These are the registers which are really hard to control anyway, and need a lot of air, and so we can't use the woodwinds quietly there anyway. If we needed something more balanced, blending more with the other sections, then we would pick the registers that have the most dynamic control, and which are most comfortable for the players, so we go more into the middle of the ranges. If our intention is to be dark and thick, then we're using low registers, or even lower instruments, and maybe choosing the instrument based on the dynamic that we need. Say your intention is to simply be soft, then you pick areas that you know can be dynamically soft, like the lower registers, and maybe relying on flutes and clarinets more than you might on the double reeds. Now that we've looked at it, let's listen to it. One work that I really like diving into, that always gives me good ideas and good practices for orchestration, is Holst's The Planet. Let's start off with a great example of how to combine the woodwinds with the other sections of the orchestra. Let's look at a bit of the third movement, Mercury, about a third of the way through. The first thing that we want to see is how Holst doubles the woodwinds with the other sections. So here, we have the motif in the violins, while the horns and clarinets play one chord per bar with the whole thing gradually crescendoing. There are 4 horns, with one note of each chord per horn, and Holst doubles each horn note with a clarinet. Horn 1 with the first clarinet, horn 2 with the second, horn 3 with the third, and the bass clarinet with the 4th horn. It's like this for 6 bars, then the oboes and bassoons join in. The top note of the chord has the first oboe, first clarinet and first horn, then the same doubling for the second note, then the cor anglais joins clarinet 3 and horn 3, and the bass oboe and 2 bassoons join the bass clarinet, horn 4 and tremolo violas on the bottom of the chord, all still gradually crescendoing, until the flutes join too, everything playing forte. We then get 2 flutes and 3 clarinets strengthening the second violins for the tune, and the first violins reach out an octave above that combo. But these long B-flat and G minor chords are again a combination of brass and winds on each part. In descending order, we get oboe 1 paired with trumpet 1, oboe 2 paired with horn 1, cor anglais with horns 2 and 3, trumpet 2 by itself an octave below trumpet 1, horn 4 with bassoon 1, bass oboe with bassoon 2, and bass clarinet with bassoon 3, while the contrabassoon is with the double basses. And finally, we get these agile phrases in the strings and winds, where each wind section doubles its string section neighbour. Contrabassoon with the basses again, bassoons with cellos, bass clarinet and clarinets with violas, and flutes with the violins, while the oboes and English horns punctuate the beats along with the harps. As we're rifling through the pages, another cool example comes up afterwards, which shows you that you don't always need to put all the notes on each part, because then the overall sound becomes boring and mushy. The third and fourth bar have these 3 quick 4-note figures, which are echoed higher up a couple of bars later. The first set is paired with the strings, which have all of the notes, but the winds have this very cool staggering to the parts, not playing every note and giving this frenetic energy to the whole phrase. Not only that, they're doubled within themselves, 2 instruments to a part, disguising any one instrument from shining through. Oboe 2 with clarinet 1, oboe 1 with clarinet 2, English horn with bass clarinet, and bass oboe with all 3 bassoons. Also, in our orchestration hacks episode, we had a part that was more focused around the winds, where we talked about the bassoons blending with the horns very well, because the horns are the bridge between the winds and the brass in the orchestra. But the rest of that example actually had some cool overlapping wind writing. So let's finish off this section by soloing that and analysing what I did. What I have here is a single 8-note phrase being repeated constantly, but juggled around the entire woodwind section. My section is 3-3-3-2, 3 flutes, 2 oboes, 1 cor anglais, and an E-flat clarinet and 2 B-flat clarinets, and the 2 bassoons that are omitted here. Each instrument usually repeats the phrase twice, plays the next downbeat, and then has a breath. Sometimes there's direct dovetailing between 2 parts, like the first phrase here between flute 1 and flute 3. But sometimes I also vary where the phrase is played, and transpose it up or down to add some harmony. If we look at each part, we see that everything is in relatively comfortable ranges, and there aren't really any big leaps around the range either. This makes the parts very straightforward, almost easy for the players, and overall the whole texture feels dense as the notes are quite close together. What keeps the interest up is that each part is handed off to another, and then taken over from an instrument on a different part of the range. So even though the overall range and set of pitches isn't varying much, the feeling is that it's constantly shifting around, as the timbre is constantly varying, thinning and thickening as it moves through the characters of the different instruments. It's a bit easier to see on the score than it is on the piano roll. And because this is easy for the players and they get a breath every bar or so, you could make a texture like this go on forever if you wanted to. You find marching bands, wind bands, symphonic wind bands and so on, but you never really get music written for just woodwinds. It's the same for brass. It's usually never without percussion. And so the only time you really hear music for woodwinds only is for wind quintets, which are 5 instruments: flute, oboe, clarinet, French horn and bassoon. You might be saying, why is there a French horn? French horns are brass, not winds. Which is right, of course, but their sound is often considered the bridge between the winds and the brass, and that's why we see them crop up in woodwind quintets. The wind quintet is really cool because you get these 5 instruments that differ quite radically from each other in their sound, but you have the interesting challenge of finding the small areas where they blend together, and then you can get really creative with trading passages and themes and ideas between the instruments. And to finish this episode off, I thought it would be fun to take a familiar melody, to this channel at least, and arrange it for a wind quintet. Tell us in the comments if you've ever written anything for woodwinds or a woodwind ensemble, and if you enjoyed that or if you had a hard time. So, have a listen and see you on the next episode of Virtual Orchestration.